Smart Blur is a relatively new filter that was added around After Effects version 7. It's an intelligent filter that looks at edges and other sharp transitions in an image, keeps those intact and sharp, and blurs the areas in between. This is useful for corrective applications such as removing noise from an image, removing wrinkles in a person's face, etc. And that's what we're going to cover in this movie. What's interesting though is Smart Blur also has an ability to show what edges it's going to keep, and that diagnostic feature has some very creative applications as well, which we'll show in the next movie. This is an example of a type of image that Smart Blur is very good at improving. I'll zoom in 200%, and you can see we've got some issues in this face, like some modeling going on in the skin, and some wrinkles around the eyes. Let's try to clean those up while keeping the details of the eyes, the teeth, etc. I'll select my layer and add Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Smart Blur. As usual in After Effects, the defaults are a bit heavy-handed, but let's go ahead and tweak those. I'm going to set the mode to Overlay Edge so I can see what edges Smart Blur is going to keep sharp and what areas it's going to blur in between. And now I see the edges it's detecting in the teeth, the lips, the eyes, etc. Now here's a gotcha about using Smart Blur. As I start to scrub down the threshold where it detects those edges, you'll see the image go a little crazy, namely like that. If you see the image doing this, you have some form of adaptive preview turned on. Under fast previews, you've either selected adaptive resolution or OpenGL with adaptive resolution turned on. And this is a relatively new option. You can either just turn off adaptive resolution for OpenGL, which you'll see now makes the problem go away, or just turn off OpenGL altogether, because it doesn't really help in this case. Now in this case, it's blurring some very broad areas in her hair and in her face. So I need to do two things. I want to reduce the radius so I don't get as obvious of a blurring effect. And now we're keeping a bit more detail in the hair and skin. And I'm also going to reduce the threshold so that less area is getting blurred. More edge details are being kept, particularly in the hair. So if I go down to about that area, the broad areas of skin in between are going to be blurred. The lines around her eyes are going to be blurred, and the rest is going to be sharpened. I'm going to go back to normal mode. I'm going to go ahead and zoom back down to 100%. And you see now that looks pretty good. This is before and after. Might be hard to see with the compression. Let's go ahead and show it at 200%. Before and after. Nice improvement in her face. Now in this case, I'm using a very small radius amount because I only want to remove just very small details and splotches. In the case of using standard def footage, a radius of about 1 would work. If you're using high def footage, you may need to raise this number. High def generally has roughly 3 times the resolution of standard def, so I might increase this number to a 3 pixel blur for high def footage. Looks a bit strange in the case of standard def, look much better in high def. Of course, if you keep cranking this number up, you can get very creative applications that no longer look realistic, look more like a sort of cartoon effect. But that's true with most effects. Crank up their settings and you start pushing them out of corrective and into more creative realms. And speaking of creative, we're going to be talking about how to use these edge modes in a very creative fashion in the next movie. Now Smart Blur has some competition. As of After Effects CS4, there's been a new plugin added called Bilateral Blur. Bilateral Blur works in a similar way. It has radius and threshold parameters, indeed searches for transitions and tries to blur in between. But there's 2 problems with bilateral blur. One, at very fine settings, you'll see it takes a very long time to calculate. Watch my mouse cursor here, and you can see it's taking forever to calculate a preview of this image. There, it finally finished. Indeed, as you go to lower threshold values, it takes longer for bilateral blur to calculate where the transitions are and how to weight them. The second thing about bilateral blur is that even at very low settings, it still has a fair amount of softening even on sharp transitions. So it's much harder to dial in very precise small changes in an image. I would use bilateral blur for broader creative applications and stick with Smart Blur when I need to do corrective applications like clean up the lines on somebody's face.